New Hampshire has a long and storied history of being a proving ground for top White House advisors. Sherman Adams, John Sununu, and Andy Card were all chiefs of staff. And now there's Corey Lewandowski, who may not share the same title, but certainly has the ear of the president. His decision to let Trump be Trump in the 2016 primary process unleashed a steamroller of a candidate and provided a crucial blast of momentum that arguably helped propel Donald Trump to the Oval Office. Corey Lewandowski, thanks for joining us this morning.
It's great to be back with you.
Appreciate it. So you've got the book here, Trump's Enemies. You're one of the most dedicated allies of the president, but in a way, the title kind of gives something away. It feels like there's a circle developing around the president and it's closing in right now.
Well, that's right. And look, this book, which is very different than the campaign book that we wrote, Let Trump Be Trump, this book, Dave Bossie and I wrote to remind the president of what got him to the White House and how he should be moving forward. And look, our philosophy of Let Trump Be Trump was important. And what we've seen, unfortunately, and what we delineate in this book is the individuals who didn't support him when he was a candidate, didn't vote for him when he was on the ballot, and then found their way into the White House. I think of guys like Gary Cohn and Rob Porter, Rex Tillerson and Sean Spicer, just to name a few. People who had no interest in seeing him be successful, but used their positions in the government to subvert the will of the president, ultimately the American people, and that's what we talk about in here.
Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, resigned. He didn't come in for much roughing up in your book at all, but now, given what you've seen in the resignation letter, do you classify him as someone who was not faithful to the president's America First vision?
No, I don't think so. I think General Mattis is a man who served his country with distinction, and what he said in his resignation letter is the president deserves a Secretary of State who aligns with his philosophy overseas, and that president's philosophy is, we've been in Afghanistan for 6,000 plus days. What are we doing and how long are we staying there for? And generals love one thing, they love war, and that's okay. But this president campaigned on the fact that we're going to bring our men and women who serve overseas home, and having a fundamental difference of philosophy with your Secretary of Defense happens with every administration, and you see members of the cabinet come and go. And now, after the midterm elections, is the right time.
You talk about that management style of Trump, that 26th floor that he's had on the Trump Tower, the way he does business. But when he got to Washington, he was surrounded by people who, as you say, tried to process him to death. Quote, if the leadership team would have embraced Mr. Trump's innate management style, which was extremely successful, the White House would have been a very different place. Do you think that's what we're getting back to now?
Look, I hope so, and I'm proud to say I'm the only book in the first 2 years where he sat down and gave a formal interview, which, you know, we put in the book verbatim so people can see it. And I asked him, hey, look, what happened? And he said, Corey, the first time I ever spent a night in Washington, D.C. was the day I was sworn in as President of the United States. So think about that. He didn't know Washington, and he relied on people who didn't have his best interest for the staffing decisions to fill his first term of the administration. And now he's going back to what he wanted, what he should have done in January of 2017, he's now doing in January of 2019.
Here's another line that caught my eye. Quote, Corey knew Paul Manafort was a rat from the second he strode up to the dinner table at Mar-a-Lago in his yachting outfit. The downside to letting Trump be Trump is that people like Manafort had access to him. Do you ever look back and say, kind of, what if I was able to win that battle and keep Manafort away from Trump? What might be different?
Look, what would be different is we know there would be no Russia fake collusion investigation by the Muellers, because what we know is the crimes that Paul Manafort was both found guilty of by a jury of his peers and pled guilty to all preceded his tenure at the Trump campaign by about a dozen years. And so if he wasn't part of that, if he wasn't offering to brief individuals overseas on the status of the campaign, there would be no Russia collusion narrative. Now, we can talk about what Hillary Clinton and Perkins Coie did by paying $5 million to a British spy, but Paul Manafort was the link between the Trump campaign and those overseas entities who Paul wanted somehow, some way, a relationship, because he had a long-standing business relationship. And what we know is that Paul was a bad guy, and he's probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail, and rightfully so. Do
you think President, or then candidate Trump, hired Paul Manafort because of those connections to Eastern Europe to try and facilitate the Trump Tower in Moscow?
No, look, he hired Paul, and I was in the room when it happened, because Paul was the delegate hunter. The last time there was a contested Republican convention, I think, was about 1976, when they were using the fax machine. And that's when Paul Manafort was at his heyday in American politics. He was working on the Reagan campaign at the time. They won that caucus, obviously. Ronald Reagan went on to become the President of the United States. And now, if you remember during the primary process, Donald Trump was winning states, but he wasn't winning delegates because of the arcane rules. So a friend recommended Paul Manafort to the campaign. He was supposed to come in to hunt delegates, and he quickly decided he wanted to do more than that. And look, I think Paul will probably admit it. The worst decision he's ever made in his life was coming to the Trump campaign.
You have an interesting approach to Robert Mueller in this book. It's clear there's a level of respect there. You also question, you know, obviously think he's formidable. You've questioned his alleged bias because of a previous relationship with Jim Comey. On the subject of the ultimate goal of his investigation, though, you write, quote, "This will lead America needlessly to a constitutional crisis, potentially forcing this issue all the way to the United States Supreme Court." So, if this is indeed a witch hunt and illegitimate, should the president abide by whatever the courts do?
I think the first and most important thing is we want to see the Mueller investigation come to an end. And I have enormous respect for Bob Mueller. But what I think we have to make sure is when his report is actually issued to the Attorney General, we have to make sure that he's followed the facts. And those facts should include what the Clinton campaign did or what other members of the Justice Department did, because Adam, what's the scariest thing of all the things that we found out was the Crossfire Hurricane program, which was the FBI's investigation into members of the Trump campaign based on their political philosophy. So Jim Comey, Andy McCabe, who's the deputy director, Strzok and Page, the individuals who we've now read their text messages at verbatim. You know, these people had an innate bias against the president, then candidate Trump, because they didn't agree with him in a political world. And that's very dangerous. And they spied on Americans through the FISA court because they didn't like their politics, and that should scare every person. So the Mueller investigation should come to a close. He should make that report public, and I hope they do, so that everybody can see it, and he should delineate what we already know. There was no collusion, cooperation, or coordination between the Trump campaign and outside entities to impact the outcome of the election.
In 2019, Mueller's likely to have investigatory competition, if you will, from Congress. Do you expect that the Democrats in Congress will be calling you to testify?
Oh, I'm sure Adam Schiff and Swalwell and these guys want to have me come back. Look, I've been very candid. I've been before the House committee twice. I testified for 12 hours. I'm happy to, I was happy to give that testimony. I testified in front of the Senate committee, and I was happy to do that. And I sat in front of the House Committee on Oversight and said, I will be here until you have no additional questions. And Congressman Swalwell was there, Congressman Schiff was there, and after 12 hours of answering their questions, they said they had no more questions, so I got up and left. For them to bring me back now is simply a political ploy for them to bring me, back to answer more questions where they had the opportunity to ask them. They don't have more questions now. And by the way, I was the final person to testify in front of that committee. So I testified early, and then I came back and testified again voluntarily. I wasn't subpoenaed. They asked me, would you come? I said, absolutely, because I know I didn't do anything wrong.
Let's shift a little bit closer to home here. Here's something that a lot of people are trying to figure out what's going on here. If President Trump faces a primary, he's very likely, at least if that person runs as a Republican, to do very well against them. Maybe a state like New Hampshire would be tough, but certainly there's not a great path to victory for anyone who might want to challenge President Trump as a Republican. So why on earth then would local Republicans be trying to clear the field or make it so that the party could come in against these candidates? It seems like if President Trump doesn't need the help, then they're inadvertently making him look weak here.
Well, Adam, I think you're exactly right. And look, I know the individuals who want to support the president because he's the president of the United States and believe that the money that he's raising at the national level, which is being put into New Hampshire for party apparatus building, should go to the incumbent because he's raising the money. But that being said, look, Donald Trump welcomes everybody into the field, okay? We welcome John Kasich. We beat him once by 19 points when there were 12 people in the field. A one-on-one with John would be happy to take, or Ben Sass, or Jeff Flake, or whoever that individual is, or multiple individuals who think they're going to come to New Hampshire and try and ingratiate themselves against an incumbent president who has delivered time and time again for the American people. So, look, I don't speak for candidate Trump or the campaign, but I'll tell you this. I'd be happy to come out of retirement to come and run the campaign one more time in New Hampshire to defeat any and all challengers to the president.
Who's the Democrat, the 2020 Democrat, if you will, right now, who is doing well but you think is going to fall flat on their face?
You know, the topic du jour today is Beto O'Rourke, who has never won a statewide office, who has raised $70 million. Look, I don't think Elizabeth Warren is a real candidate, but I do think the Democrats have some real candidates. Let me tell you who I think they are. I think Joe Biden is somebody who connects very well with the blue collar and can do well in working class neighborhoods because he's had that for a long time, and he's 100% name ID. I think Michael Bloomberg is progressive enough on the left with his issues of supporting gun control that he has an opportunity to win votes in the Democratic caucus. And the luxury that Michael Bloomberg has that nobody else has is he can write $100 or $250 million check tomorrow and it doesn't materially impact his net worth. And so that's a very dangerous thing, because what we've seen from the Trump campaign side is bypassing the traditional way of raising money of $2,700 increments across the country is extremely a cumbersome process. So if you're Michael Bloomberg and you decide, I want to go and write a check for $250 million to kick off his campaign, that goes a long way in helping influence the outcome of the primaries. So I look at Bloomberg, I look at Kamala Harris, and I look at Joe Biden as three very real candidates for the Democrats.
Now, looking a little farther into the future, one of the most interesting questions is what happens to the Trump movement when President Trump is no longer president, whether that's in 8 years or whatever the number would be now. I think you would be as likely a candidate as anyone to capitalize on that movement. So what do you think about running for office someday? Is that something that's potentially in the future, say even here at home against Senator Shaheen in 2020?
Boy, I hope not, right? My family has stuck by me through a lot, through the witch hunt and through being on the road all the time, being gone from, look, I've got young kids who go to school here in New Hampshire, and look, being gone is a hard thing, and you can't get that time back, and I know how difficult it is to go out and campaign. And look, I have a fairly good national profile. I've had the privilege to write a couple nice books, and people support me as I travel. But I think the role of an elected official is best for somebody else. And as long as the president is in office, I'm going to help support him. And very candidly, I'm part of the Vice President's Political Action Committee. I was the person who helped to choose then Governor Pence to be the vice presidential nominee for us. I'm very close to that team, and he would be my first choice after the Trump administration to take over that mantle.
One last quote here. Quote, "For Donald Trump, it's always about the story. The reaction of his audience is always important to him." Do you ever worry that he loses himself sometimes in that coverage? Every time a president has to make a hard decision, sometimes they need to cut out the noise. But for Donald Trump, sometimes his compass is the noise. So do you worry about that sometimes, that he gets lost in that perception game?
You know, I had the privilege just last week to spend 2.5 hours with the president having lunch in the president's dining room right off the Oval. And for a kid from Lowell, Massachusetts, to have that privilege is beyond humbling. But I see how laser focused he is. And what I see is a man who has grown into the job. And it's to the chagrin of some of the mainstream media who want to say it's chaos in the White House and this is not presidential. But if he didn't do it his way, he wouldn't be successful. He wouldn't have had all the successes that he has been able to achieve in the first 2 years. That being said, he is a pervasive watcher of the news. He wants to know what other people are saying. But in his heart of hearts, he believes he knows what's right for the American people, and that's how he's been governing, and that's how he's going to continue to govern.
All right, Corey Lewandowski, we appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me.
See you back here.